Oh, well, thank you very much. It's a great audience for the evening. I had no idea. I mean, I come here a fair amount, but I never know what to expect, and it's nice to see that the crowds are getting larger and larger. I don't think this is just about me. I think a lot of it is the state of the world. It's the fact that politics and geopolitics are unnerving us more. The U.S. election is unnerving us more. We see this happening. First of all, thank you to Kyoko, who's wonderful. She has been interviewing me, making it sound like she only interviews me once a year. That's not true. She interviews me frequently. And so we know each other. We kind of understand how each other's mind works a little bit. She's very kind when she says that by virtue of being an exchange student, that I know something about growing up in Japan. That's clearly not true. But I will say that I try really hard to put myself in the shoes of other people. I thought it was so interesting to read David Brooks the other day saying, look, I was just so wrong about Trump because, you know, I guess I just, as a journalist, I didn't know anybody that supported him. I'm like, then you shouldn't be writing about him. That's fairly obvious, right? I mean, I'm quite sensitive to the fact that I run the world's largest political risk firm, and I'm an American. And that when I travel outside the US, that might make a lot of people think that I'm going to provide an American-centric view of the world. That's something you have to get over. As someone who, I mean, I've been to a lot of countries, but I did grow up in this country, and this is my native language. And we're bad at this, right? And I think that's one of the reasons we do tend to get a lot of this wrong. And the G0 should have been obvious to a lot of people, but we weren't ready to accept the fact that the world was such a different place and that America's role in it was going to be so deeply different. Kyoko suggested that I was going to talk about what happens when US foreign policy is in decline. I do think our influence in foreign policy is in decline. I don't believe that means America's in decline. I don't believe that at all. The role of our dollar is incredibly strong. People want to come to our universities. Chinese, Russians, Arabs, if they can afford it, they want to buy our real estate, right? I mean, our country is still the world's largest economy, and while China will be the largest economy relatively soon, I do believe that, but even when that happens, America will have by far the largest military. They'll have by far the most robust technology and innovation centers. They'll have a population with demographics that are quite healthy. And they'll also be the world's largest producers of oil, of gas, and of food. I also love our neighbors, Mexico and Canada, right? Those are great neighbors. 2 oceans, fantastic neighbors, right? Yeah. Wouldn't Japan like to have neighbors like that? Like, no, you'd love to have neighbors like that, right? Mexico's awesome. I remember, you know, and so, I mean, geopolitically, we're very insulated. But of course, that's one of the reasons why our foreign policy influence is in decline. There are really a lot of reasons. I mean, you know, a couple $1 trillion spent on failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will do it to you. I think that the fact that we have an energy revolution, so we don't need as much from the Middle East, they're not as relevant to us, that'll do it to you. A successful Iran deal didn't make everyone happy, but destroys OPEC and means that the Americans can take a more balanced view in terms of geopolitics in the region, that'll do it to you. A president that doesn't have any foreign policy background, nor much of the inclination, that'll do it to you. The fact that his second-term team was much weaker on international issues, and particularly on Asia issues, that'll do it to you. The fact that America's allies are much weaker today and much less coherent on supporting the United States on foreign policy issues, whether you talk about Russia or NATO, whether you talk about Iran or ISIS or Saudi Arabia, whether you talk about China, that'll do it to you. Or the fact that China is growing and they have more capabilities, but they don't necessarily want to support American policy, that their political system, their economic system is radically different and is changing, but is not changing anywhere near as fast as they're growing. That'll do it to you. The fact that tools that America can deploy to engage in foreign policy are themselves more unilateral. We're talking about cyber, we're talking about drones, right? We're talking about sanctions and the use of the banking system and the dollar as a stick, as a club to wield against other countries to get them to do things that we want. That'll do it to you. In other words, there are lots of reasons to understand why American foreign policy influence is in decline. And while I happen to believe that that is a problematic thing, there are many Americans that do not. Why? I'll give you an example. I personally believe that Obama's foreign policy legacy is very deeply mixed. I think Latin America, and particularly the Cuba opening, but generally Latin America, Argentina, I think that the future of Venezuela, I think has been absolutely a win for the United States. U.S.-Latin American relations today are dramatically better, both in today's reality and in trajectory, than they were when Obama became president. Give him credit on that. I give him credit on the Iran deal. I think he could have pushed harder because the Iranian government understood they were going to get a better deal under Obama than under anyone that came after him. So if he pushed harder and stuck around longer, he probably could have gotten a little more, particularly on the weapons embargo issue. But on balance, I think it was a good deal. Give him credit on that. And I give him credit on TPP, which by far is the biggest for me. And I've said this on record. Trans-Pacific Partnership, assuming it gets done, and I think it will, in the lame duck in all likelihood. I don't think Paul Ryan's going to let it go down. But assuming it gets done, I think that's the most important legacy. But I got to tell you, I like TPP because I look long-term about the importance of the United States continuing to lead international standards. I see the importance of getting the Chinese to want to reform more over time, to engage and align with America and its allies. And because I think America's losing jobs anyway, mostly by virtue of technology, not as much by globalization. It's true that TPP will lose jobs for America. It'll gain some for agriculture. It'll lose more for manufacturing. But I got to tell you, if instead of just being Ian Bremmer, PhD political scientist who's been to 100 countries, if I was Ian Bremmer, kid from my mother in the projects in Chelsea, who didn't do that and instead ended up without a great education and without much of a job and felt like I didn't have many opportunities, like many Americans today, I don't know why I would support TPP. I don't know why I would support globalization. I don't know why I would support NATO. I really don't. It's not clear to me what I get out of it, right? And I think that there are two fundamental problems out there. One is that, sort of the top 1% of Americans did not do a good job selling the average American that, the continued enrichment in the United States was going to be useful for them. I think we failed at that. And secondly, I think that we failed in explaining why globalization was ultimately going to trickle down and help the average American. I think that that's caused problems for us. Now, let me be clear. I think the likelihood that Trump will become the next president is virtually zero. I actually believe that. And I can talk about why if you like. But I also think that what's behind Trumpism is powerful and will stay with us for a long time because we're not going to address these issues. Because I think we will get TPP done. And I think jobs will go away. So Obama, I don't know how many of you read that wonderful piece on the Obama doctrine. How many of you? Show of hands. Okay, I want to give you just a recommendation. If you cared enough to come out and see me tonight, which is kind of a big deal, because New York there's a lot of stuff going on in New York. Care enough then to spend 30 minutes to an hour to read the piece in The Atlantic last month on the Obama doctrine. It is the seminal piece on explaining who Obama is and what he's trying to accomplish, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. And it's a piece that I did not expect would come out until a couple years after Obama was out of office, and he actually allowed it to happen now. It's an incredible piece. But what was so interesting about it is you do understand, right, that this is a guy who would much rather be remembered as the most intelligent president that the U.S. has ever had and not be the greatest one than be remembered as the greatest president but not particularly bright. And that really resonated with me because I would feel the same way, but I don't want to be president, right? I really identified with it. I thought, wow, Obama would be a pretty good president of Eurasia Group, you know? He'd like be a really good analyst. And you get this sense, right? It's really important for him to be right. He indicts the entire Washington foreign policy community in ways that really resonated for me. You know, people, all of these old white guys, they're like, well, this is the way it's been done, so this is the way it needs to be done. I was fascinated to see how Obama on Syria felt so liberated by, he set these red lines, which he shouldn't have done, but then when it came to time to actually choose, you're going to bomb or you're going to not bomb, and everyone's saying you got to bomb, not because it's going to actually help your policy in Syria. In fact, you're probably going to kill a bunch of civilians because they'll use them as human shields in these places, but because you need to maintain credibility of American policy. And he's like, you know what? That's what they're saying. I don't care. I'm just going to do it. Now, sometimes he makes good decisions there. Sometimes he makes horrible decisions there. But it's very interesting to see that tension. But what I find really interesting is the seeds in the United States in foreign policy have been towards more unilateralism. American foreign policy has been more Chinese over the years, right? We're less interested in promoting our values as universal values. We're less interested in supporting our allies to make long-standing commitments that are great for them, but maybe not tactically as great for us. We're less interested in determining, in either being the global policeman or in being the global curator of trade and international architecture. There is increasingly a race to the bottom. The United States is not becoming isolationist. Obama is not, in my view, in any way an isolationist. He's very interventionist. There are lots of drone strikes. There's incredible cyber surveillance. There's a great willingness to use sanctions against enemies and against allies to get them to do what America wants. But there's not as much commitment to American allies. And when you talk to those allies around the world, and I talk to foreign ministers of most of America's allies everywhere, they all say, Ian, what is America really committed to us? Do they really stand for us? Now, here's what's interesting. I think you can make the argument that Trump is actually, in many ways, the logical extreme of where the United States has been going. He says he's not an isolationist. I agree. When Trump says he wants to take the oil, when Trump says we're going to bomb the crap out of these people, or uses another word, right? When he says that, you know, we're going, he even talks about potentially sending 30,000 troops to Syria. Then he backs off. He says maybe, maybe not. But nonetheless, this is absolutely an interventionist line. But it's someone who is saying, people are taking advantage of us. I don't want to do that anymore. The Mexicans are coming here to rape our women. The Europeans are free riding on our largesse. By the way, Obama said the exact same thing in the Atlantic article. Probably shouldn't have, but he said it, right? That the Middle East allies are not acting in a very allied way, and we're going to boycott their oil unless they start actually paying for their own defense and doing something in the region. The Japanese and Chinese are robbing us blind. Unless it's locked down, we don't get a damn thing out of these people, right? Actually a fairly consistent and even coherent worldview. It's disastrous, except I completely understand why a significant portion of Americans would actually find it compelling, right? We'll talk more about this, I'm sure. But because I assume everyone wants to ask about it, I figured I'd throw it out there. I will get to the Japanese and the Chinese perspectives, and you can bring me anywhere you want in terms of questions. But talk about why it is that I think it's become so popular. So, number one, because real wages for the average American have been stagnant for basically 2 generations. And so as a consequence, they do not feel that establishment politicians on either side of the aisle have done anything to benefit them, and they're basically right. That's one. But it's only one. I think a second reason has to do with identity. I think the fact is that younger Americans are much more multicultural. They're much more socially liberal. They're much more secular. They support legalization of pot and same-sex marriage and abolition of the death penalty. And I did a survey of Americans asking them what they thought about where America was heading, and it was really incoherent until I broke it down by age. And then when you looked at Americans over 50, you realize that over 75% of them said that they did not identify with the country that the United States was or was becoming. And we've never had, in the Cold War period, we never had that kind of a feeling, and now we do. I think that identity issue is a very significant one, and you're seeing it in Europe too, of course. It's one of the reasons why you have all of the populism and the extremism on the left and, more importantly, on the right across many of the European states. I think a third reason, which we should not underestimate, is the importance of social media and the fact that 8 years ago social media was not particularly a thing, and now it is, and Trump knows how to use it. And he has over 7 million Twitter followers. Cruz doesn't have 1 million yet. And that is, it is a medium that allows you to actually sculpt your message and have people pick it up exactly the way you want it to be. And so that advantage in the Republican nominee field is extraordinary for him. And furthermore, mainstream media is going bankrupt. And so it's consolidating. Right? And that means as well, they don't have the money to follow the stories themselves, so they have to pick it up from social media. But the most important story in 2 years in the United States is, of course, the election. And so you have to get ratings because you may be free media, but first of all, you're free market media, so you have to make sure that you can keep employing your people. And therefore, the ratings you're chasing are going to be the people that can continue to get the eyeballs, and that is overwhelmingly on the Republican side, Mr. Trump. It's even somewhat overwhelmingly across the board, so the free media has been astonishing. I think those are the 4 reasons why he's doing well, but those are also reasons why you'll end up seeing more of this, both on the left and on the right, much more polarization in the United States. Does this bother me? I am made somewhat more optimistic by the fact that the United States increasingly does not have policymaking in Washington. Policymaking happens both decentralized, it happens at the state level and at the local level, and we see that with the energy revolution, and we see that with same-sex marriage, we see that with a whole bunch of things. But it's also, look at the Paris Agreement on climate. Paris Agreement on climate was not because the US government and other governments said they were suddenly going to get it done. It's because non-state actors, billionaires, CEOs of corporations, Mike Bloomberg, Bill Gates, Jack Ma from Alibaba, and a bunch of mayors got together, said our governments aren't doing it, so we need to actually make a difference. We need to invest in new technologies. We need to drive new policies. And it led to a better outcome on climate. So I do believe that the longer the G0 persists, the more we will see the Westphalian system that is state-centric start breaking down, and other actors will start playing a larger role. That is clearly already happening in the Middle East. There's only, for the last 40 years, the Middle East was relatively stable, or a better term, had frozen instability for 3 reasons. Number 1, the Americans and allies provided security. Number 2, you could take a lot of money out of the ground. Number 3, the populations were poorly governed, but reasonably quiescent. All 3 of those things have gone away. And so, of course, the Middle East is now reverting to a pre-Westphalian state. What does that mean about the future of Saudi Arabia? Nothing good. Nothing good. What does that mean about the future of the Kurds? Actually, probably quite promising. So it depends on how you think about it, right? You are reverting to things that are more governable, actually, for many of these places. Now, if that's the United States, what do I think about and the future for the U.S.? Yes, Asia clearly more important than the Middle East. Yes, Asia with lots of allies that want more U.S. in a more obvious way than the Europeans, than the Eurasians, than the Africans, than anyone but Latin America. Latin America will be the easiest win for the U.S., and what you've already seen happening in Argentina will happen in Venezuela, in Brazil, and yes, even in Cuba over time, and we can talk about that. But Asia will be more attractive. But Asia's also a much heavier lift. Asia is going to be more challenging for the Americans to do. The Chinese are spending lots of money. They're writing really big checks. Are the Americans going to compete with that? Probably not. Probably not. The Americans are still going to be the dominant security power for many of these countries, but the Chinese are going to be the dominant economic power, and that, of course, is going to cause more tension over time. The good thing about Asia, and it's really quite a good thing, unlike Europe, is that in Asia you actually have a series of leaders that have strong political capital. They have a lot of capability to really govern. They're not really threatened at home, at least for now, and that allows them to be more strategic and focus on what needs to be done over the long term. And I see that, of course, in China. I see that, of course, in Japan. I see that, of course, in India. I see it in Indonesia. And I think one of the good things about that is it means that these challenges that are real in the South China Sea, for example, and in the East China Sea, and even over Taiwan or between India and Pakistan, are going to be contained despite the escalation, and that the economic relations will maintain strength. Now, if you are China, the strategy should be continue as much transformative economic reform as possible while keeping everything stable. I will tell you, as many leaders that have told me they wanted to see Hillary as president, and most foreign ministers I know, almost all, in the last 3 years, when I've asked them, what do you think about 2016, they all say we'd be very happy with Hillary. One big exception, China. And it's because the Chinese view Hillary as a bit of a hawk. They don't like her on economic statecraft vis-a-vis state capitalism, and they think that she's kind of pro-containment. But in the last 3 months, I've spoken with high-level Chinese officials that are like, actually, we want Hillary. Not like Putin. Putin wants Trump, right? Putin should want Trump. Trump's like, I want to get rid of NATO. Putin's like, awesome. Awesome. That's my president, right? That's the kind of guy I want. You know? I mean, Trump is like, let's kick out all the Muslims. Putin's like, I wish I thought of that. There's some coherence going on there, real meeting of the minds. But the Chinese want stability. The Chinese don't want, like, the potential of someone to screw it up. Why? Because the Chinese feel pretty strong. They feel pretty stable. Give us a good operating environment. We'll make incremental gains as we build our military, but don't rock the boat. Let us fix our economy. And as long as that continues to go smoothly, as long as they continue to focus on squeezing the SOEs in the strategic sectors that are very inefficient and spending the real stimulus on the consumers, and as long as that doesn't threaten to blow up in their faces, which certainly doesn't seem to be the case anytime soon, then I think you'll see that stability. So that's a good plan. So if you're Japan, final point before we have a little discussion, what do you do if you're Japan? And the answer is really hard if you're Japan, right? Because as much as this is a great strategy for China for the next, like, 2, 3, 5 years, when I think about 10 years in China, I think about a country that's really uncertain. I think about a country that might be able to transform itself to be truly consumer-led. And I think about a country that might start getting there in a real serious way, and then the politics starts unlocking, and they're not capable of decentralizing power to govern differently for wealthier parts of the country than they are for poorer parts, and the people get empowered by technology, and they start losing lots of jobs because automation and AI is like, well, we don't need people to do services or manufacturing in China. And Japan is, you don't have that problem. You're running out of people in Japan, right? Which is awesome from an AI perspective, right? You're like the one country you can do automation, no one's going to complain. We're like, well, we don't have people for those jobs. So you don't have jobs, not a problem. In China, serious problem, right? So if that happens, then Japan's in serious trouble. Then Japan's like, we better keep a strong relationship with the US. We better really hedge that, better have a security relationship. But if China makes it, if they make it, then Japan is the model. The Brits are like, we want to be China's best friend. We're going to join the AIIB first. Are you kidding me? The Brits have virtually nothing to really offer the Chinese over the long term. They're thinking about leaving Europe to make themselves completely irrelevant to China, right? Completely irrelevant. The Japanese, they have the oldest society out there along with South Korea. China's going to have a really old society. You got healthcare that actually works for that. China's going to need that. You got a consumer sector oriented for that. China's going to need that. You've got infrastructure that's really resilient. China's going to need that, right? You got a service sector that's world class. China's going to need that. you've got everything out there that the Chinese are going to need and you're not going to be competing with them economically in a way that India really is. You're going to be getting smaller. And so if China succeeds, you do not want to be America's aircraft carrier, because that will prevent you from actually having that economic relationship. So you need a hedge. You absolutely need a hedge. And if my argument would be, if Abe's first term was all about domestic, Abenomics 1.0 is domestic, and it's create more competitiveness and bring women into the market and all that, some which successful, some which not so much. But the Abenomics 2.0, I think, isn't like more domestic economic. Abenomics 2.0 is your real market. It's global. Your corporations aren't Japanese anymore anyway. The number of Japanese clients I have, and they got 10% of our business in Japan. Okay, sounds like you should be doing other stuff, right? Well, why wouldn't your prime minister reflect that? Go out, plant a lot of flags. You want to be as known for a one belt, one road policy in 5 years' time as the Chinese are. But your one belt, one road won't fall apart in 25 years because you actually know how to build belts and roads, which the Chinese don't. That would be my strategy. Now, at the end of the day, right, I'm an American telling you stuff. Again, and I'm sensitive to the fact that there's only so far that can go. But I do think that Japan is not in the horrible position. Final thing I'll say is when I look at all the major economies in the world today, I think that Japan's geopolitical trajectory in the last 24 months has been the most favorable of anyone. Your China relationship has become more normalized. Your South Korea relationship is still pretty bad, but more normalized. Your India relationship is the best in the world, right? Your Southeast Asia relationships are all pretty good. You're the only people that aren't really despised in the Middle East because all you do is send humanitarian aid. They're like, that's nice. We don't even know why they're doing that. There are no Japanese here, but it's cool. We appreciate it, right? And the one country you haven't fixed yet, Russia, where Obama called Abe, and he told you guys, he's like, don't go because we want to punish the Russians. And the Japanese are like, well, everyone else is saying that like the Canadians are going to go and the Chinese are already investing and you don't want just them to be dominating it. And you told the Brits not to join the AIIB and they told you to go talk to the hand. So we're going to go. I think there's a good chance that Japan-Russia relations will actually be on a better trajectory. That's smart. The Japanese should really be focusing on continuing that trajectory. And I think there's great capability to do that. Because ultimately, the Japanese society is not about militarization. Ultimately, the platform is not about exporting values and norms that other people are not interested in. It's much more harmonious. And I think that that's something that you should really be betting an awful lot on. So those are a few words on geoeconomics in the US and Japan, and a few other things. I never write these speeches. I don't really know what I'm going to say until I get in front of you guys. But with that, we're going to have a little discussion with Kyokyo, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight, okay? Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so I was very, very happy to be here tonight because I thought you made a wrong prediction in January. But listening to your lecture, I thought maybe you were not wrong. So let's start from there. So in January, you said, I quote, this is you, I don't see any chance that Trump become the next president of the United States. You said at the lecture today, there's no chance. I just want to confirm that. Do you think there's no chance for Trump to be the next United States president?
I will tell you, so no chance. I mean, I am surprised that he has been able to maintain the ability to entertain the Americans for as long as he has. No, I have tweeted that there is a part of me that will miss Trump. It's the part that likes bourbon. But it is a part of me. I mean, I like that part of me. It's a fun part. So he has. I mean, for 7-8 months now, he's been able to dominate the polls. If you had asked me in January, I would have said I thought he'd slip more by now. He has slipped, but he's not slipped as much as I thought he would. But he slipped for the Republican primaries. And the Republican primaries are a special sort of thing that relatively few people participate in. And they're mostly people that are really excited about politics. And he's been able to get a lot of people excited about politics. But if he wins, so I would say, I think he has about a 55% chance of getting the Republican nomination.
55.
55.
Okay.
I mean, when we do our projections right now, this week, Eurasia Group, looking at all of the remaining states and where the polls are now. Some of those polls are really good. Some of those polls are really weak. We get about, I want to say, 1,244 delegates. So it's like 7 above what he needs. And actually, he could do a few less than a majority because he could get a number of the unclaimed as well, but he won't get most of them. In other words, it's almost a coin flip. He could, and he's going to have a lot of people coming after him over the next few weeks. It's not making it any easier on him. But if he gets the nomination, and if he doesn't get the nomination, he's not, if it's a contested convention, he's not getting it. It's that simple. Will that cause a problem in America? Yeah, sure. I mean, look, he's already causing a problem because we're talking about him, right? I mean, so that's a problem. But the point is, in a 2-year election that costs over $5 billion, it's already a subversion of democracy. So, I mean, the fact that we need to be entertained over 2 years should not surprise anyone. I mean, it should be a 2-month election, and it should cost very little. But if he wins the nomination, the negatives that he has among average rank-and-file Americans, among women, among Hispanics, among young people, are astonishingly high. They're unprecedentedly high historically. And I just do not believe, I mean, you know, Hillary is, the internet scandal is going to stick. There might even be some indictments against some of her senior people. Lord knows Trump is going to play pretty hard, and he's going to come after not only Hillary but Bill, and that's going to hurt. And she's vulnerable. She's not a great candidate. I get it. But can he win? No. We take ourselves too seriously in this country. And we take our news too seriously, and we get too excited. And there's a bit of a Chicken Little complex going on about the Trump administration. And I understand that there are a lot of people that want to make sure that there's no chance, and there are also a lot of people that want to make news off of it. I refuse to do this. I think the reality is that there is virtually zero chance that he is going to be the president of the United States in 2017.
Okay, so we're going to shift to Trump, but one more question about Trump,
Yeah, sure.
before we go.
Yeah.
So I read your book about the Superpower.
No, I mean, I talked about him because I know people want to ask, but that's very different from
One more
saying,
question about
I
Trump.
refuse to say he's going to be president, let's watch out.
Okay, so but he says in New York Times that I am America first,
Yeah.
right? And then I do follow his comments and stuff, and I read your book about the superpower. And there is a similarity between independent America and I am America first. So is there a difference between independent America and also America first? Because I ask you this, because usually when I do interview you for the last 5 years, you don't really tell me your view. But in this book for the first time, out of Moneyball, out of Indispensable America, and out of Independent America, you chose yourself, you're more shifting to Independent America, which is very similar to the idea that Trump is saying. So would you just differentiate? What is the difference between your idea as an independent America and his I am America first policy?
It's very clear he's not an isolationist, as I said. But I did write. Well, first of all, I don't like independent America. But I reluctantly came to the conclusion that it was the policy of the three that we were most capable of actually implementing well. Independent America absolutely looks a bit like Trump when you talk about why are we doing all this stuff in the Middle East. Like you have people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham that are saying, let's put 20,000 troops in Syria.
Right.
I happen to believe that that would cost a lot. It would cause geopolitical blowback. It would lead to casualties, and it would not improve the situation on the ground. So I don't think there's anyone credible that's coming up with things that would be really interventionist in the Middle East that would help. And so given that, I would much rather be honest and say we're not going to help. I was with the Ukrainian president a month ago, and I sat down with him in Munich, and I said, look, if you had known that America wasn't going to help you, would it have changed the way you behaved? Right? And it was a sad question to ask him, and it really affected him. You know, you could see like he was like, yeah, this kind of sucked. But the fact is, America promised a lot to Ukraine and didn't follow through. And my point on independent America is like, if we're not going to do it, then let's be honest. Because we don't. The worst thing you can do is tell your friends we're there for you, and then they get all lathered up, and then you're not there for them. Like that's a mistake, right? But independent America actually said we were going to lead by example. Independent America was very unifying at home. It was saying if we're not going to project our values on other countries that refuse to listen, so China's not going to become democratic no matter what we tell them. And if the Middle East did become democratic, we wouldn't like the outcomes. But we need to focus on actually having such an extraordinary environment at home, accepting refugees, right? Because we were the melting pot. I mean, right now, my suggestion is we should get Cristo, the Italian artist, to come to New York Harbor and get a big orange tarp and just put it around the Statue of Liberty until we figure out if we really stand by it or not, right? Because we shouldn't be looking at it, because we don't stand for it. We just don't know. So let's just put it on hold and figure it out, right? So independent America was saying, no, let's take the tarp off. We really do believe in the Statue of Liberty, and we really do believe in our founding fathers. We really do believe in the Constitution. You see, Trump at home is not a unifier. Trump's a divider. Trump doesn't believe in the Constitution. He wants to stop all Muslims from coming in. It's unconstitutional. He's not interested in accepting refugees at all. He wants to get rid of the illegals, including those that were born here. It's unconstitutional. He's not Thomas Jefferson. He's George Jefferson, right? Moving on up, my friends. Yeah, it's all show, but it's not. But there's not. I mean, he's not a black guy. But aside from that, so he's really not. And I'll tell you something funny. So I actually gave a talk and wrote a piece about this about 3 months ago, and said, that Trump is not an isolationist, but he's not Make America Great Again. He's really America First. That's what I said.
Yeah.
But I was saying it because America First in the 30s and 40s was a group of people that were saying stay out of World War II, right? And because we need to focus at home. And I wasn't saying it in a positive way. Then the New York Times, picking up on that, said, oh, well, isn't it, like Ian said, isn't it America First? And he's like, yes. I'm like, oh. He picked it up. That should not surprise me. So apparently the Times is writing a piece right now, Maggie Haberman, talking about like why I thought America First was not inappropriate, but it's going to be, read the piece later this week. I don't know what we're going to do with it. But
so G0 made you famous. Now America First is your next thing.
Infamous will make me infamous. No, I mean, but the point is that America First is a logical outcropping of too much G0, right? Because we see all of the stuff getting worse in neighborhoods, and our allies don't want to help us, and we think it's enormously costly, and we don't have any great outcomes, and we're not helping the people at home. So who would be surprised that America First would emerge? My hope was that we would have the better part of America First, that we would be saying, yes, we want to focus on the U.S., but we want to do it in a way that's constructive for the rest of the world, that will make them aspire. Because my first trip outside the U.S. was in 1986. I went to the Soviet Union. I had just finished my freshman year in college. And a professor of mine led a trip to the Soviet Union. I was really excited to go. And Gorbachev had just come into office in April, I think it was, and I was there in June for the whole summer. And what amazed me, because I had never been anywhere, what amazed me was how so many young Soviets, and I met Ukrainians, and I went to Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia, and we went to Leningrad and Moscow too, was how affected they were by American values, by Voice of America, how affected they were by our captive nations parades, by Radio Free Liberty, how much our values meant to them.
At that time.
At that time, that they really believed that we stood for something, and they aspired to that, and that was eroding the Soviet power. And what an amazing thing. And the idea that America could lead by example was so valuable. And yet today, if you go and talk to young Russians, they don't actually think that we lead by example anymore. They point to Guantanamo, and they point to Lehman Brothers and Madoff, and they point to Trump. And they say we don't lead. They point to Ferguson, and they say we don't lead by, and that hurts me.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I read also the Obama doctrine. In it, the Obama says still it's the United States who set the agenda for G20. It's still the United States who set the agenda for G7, right? So do you think we're going to have an East Asia Summit in Japan in May? The Abe is the person who is going to set the agenda, or the United States who is going to set the agenda?
Well, my point is, Obama is correct when he says that to the extent that anyone sets the agenda, it is the United States. When I wrote the book Superpower, I said, look, it's not like China's threatening the U.S. to become another superpower. It is just that what superpower means is not what it used to mean.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I would argue that to the extent that a global agenda is being set, it is being set by the Americans. But I would also argue that it is being set much less frequently, much less effectively, with much weaker support of fewer allies. I mean, ask the Saudis how much they support the Americans' agenda setting globally. Ask the Brits. Ask the Japanese. It's better in some countries than it is in others, don't get me wrong. But I mean, a good judge of whether or not the United States is doing better in foreign policy than it was 10 years ago is you look around the world and say, well, are our relationships stronger or weaker? In Latin America, they're generally stronger. In almost every other part of the world, they're weaker, in most cases precipitously weaker. And that's particularly true with our most important allies historically, those in Europe. And I mean, when Merkel, who was the leader of Europe, you know, sort of when the wall came down, Berlin Wall, the United States was there for the Germans. The walls are now going up in Europe. And Merkel looked to the US and said, we need help. And the Americans said, we got nothing for you. Nothing for you. And I talked to Christine Lagarde about this, who is one of Merkel's best friends, and she's like that Merkel was deeply affected personally by this, deeply saddened, shocked. Maybe she shouldn't have been, but she was. And I think that's serious.
No alliance there.
No, I mean, look, there's still an alliance. I call it a hollow alliance. It's weaker, but it's important, and yet we're not talking about it. And so I think that's the trajectory. And I think that Obama, you know, as much as Obama's been such an incredible thinker through so many of these issues, and yet his willingness to lead is not there. He says the peace itself, which I think you have. You do. She has it. She has it. She's awesome.
I did homework.
She has the peace. Yeah, but you didn't know I was going to talk about it. The peace, he doesn't have a doctrine. He has a toolkit. And some of those tools are important. Don't do stupid shit, right? And strategic patience. And there's no question that those tools have served him well in Latin America, because strategic patience and don't do stupid shit works well when the region and countries are moving towards you. But don't do stupid shit and strategic patience when the world is falling apart doesn't work well. And in the Middle East, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And when you talk about countries that are thinking about, do I want to do China? Do I want to do the United States? A country like Britain, the longer you wait, the more they're like, I'm worried. Maybe I need to hedge more towards China. We're seeing this play out. And you know, one thing I criticize Obama for is he refuses to admit he's wrong on anything. He's right analytically more often than he's wrong, but he refuses to ever admit that he's wrong. And he's also not a visionary. Where I would argue that on domestic politics, whether you like him or not, he's actually quite a visionary. When you hear him on race, you hear him on religion, this is a guy that really wants to transform society in a way that many Trump supporters really hate for reasons that are kind of understandable. But a lot of young Americans think that's really exciting.
Yes.
But on foreign policy, he's the antithesis of a visionary. He's a tactician. He's very risk averse. And I would argue, I think that what America needs in the next president, we're not going to get it. But what we need, we can't have a revolutionary because America's not in crisis. And when you're not in crisis, you're not going to get a revolutionary. But we do need a visionary. We need someone that can stand up and tell America, we know that you don't know what we stand for. We know that you don't know where we're going. Here's where we're going. Here's what we stand for. That's what we actually need.
So if there is a visionary president, what is the main goal for the United States to say, so this is my vision, so let's go that way? What is that way?
Well, the Superpower book laid out 3 visions.
Okay.
And I think you could you could do indispensable. I think it's really hard. But you could say, look, if the United States doesn't do it, if the US doesn't set out that values and norms are important, no one else will. So you know what? The IMF is getting weaker, we're going to strengthen it. You know what? NATO's getting weaker, we're going to strengthen it. And we're going to build these alliances. TPP is a piece of that. But TTIP too. Got to do it with the Europeans too. You're going to do as much as possible, and you're going to join AIIB. You're going to join the Chinese organizations, and you're going to do everything possible to build a group of like-minded countries inside those groups and try to make them more aligned with our values. That's indispensable. That would be a vision. Another vision would be, guys, too expensive, can't get it done, too much domestic division, we're going to do Moneyball.
Moneyball.
And Moneyball's saying, look, you're never going to argue values in a world where the Europeans don't even know what they stand for. The Chinese know what they stand for, but it's certainly not democracy. It's political stability and economic growth. The Russians know what they stand for. It's a strong Kremlin, strong Putin, and control over their backyard, which is bigger than you'd like it to be, right? So what we're going to do is just focus on those regions where we know we can invest and we can win. So we're going to really pivot to Asia, not Obama pivot to Asia.
Okay.
Where Obama pivots. A pivot is you take one foot and you move it. You actually move the foot. Foot used to be there. The foot's not there anymore. Middle East, Obama keeps trying to move his foot, and he keeps the toe down. He keeps the toe.
He wants to go to Latin America. He wants to go to Asia, but it's stuck.
But there ain't no pivot, right? And that's the frustration. Is not that he wants to not bomb Syria, but that he ends up with more troops in Afghanistan. He's back in Iraq again. He's sort of sucked into Syria. He's thinking about getting sucked into Libya, right? No, Moneyball would say, we're doing Asia. The Europeans don't want to pay for NATO. Fine, we're doing Asia. You don't want a TTIP? Britain's a second-tier power? Fine, we're doing Asia. Because China's the big concern, we got to work it, and the Asian allies really need us, and that's where the economies are growing at. That's the future. And Latin America, because they're stuck anyway, right? And Canada, because that's basically the United States, right?
And we already
that's
talked about this.
Moneyball.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and
then independent. And independent would basically say we're going to lead by example. So I am not suggesting there's only one vision. There are 3 visions, but I think we need one.
So I just going back to one more questions and then open to everybody, right, for the questions. So you didn't answer the last part for the East Asia Summit. In this world, in this uncertainty world, what do you think is going to be the agenda in East Asia Summit in Japan? What should be the agenda?
Look, I don't think that big summitry is creating transformative agendas. I think these things are very incremental.
Because we are in the G0 world.
I think that an East Asian summit should really be primarily focused on better cooperation and transparency so that mistakes and escalation don't become calamitous. So when the Indonesians and the Chinese have an issue with a boat that gets rammed, that's in territorial waters of another country or contested, that you can handle it quietly, you can handle it bilaterally, and if you can't, there's a multilateral avenue that can come in. I think you need more of that. You need more trust, more contact, but this is small ball. I don't see, you're not going to create dramatically new Asian architecture in the next couple of years. And you're certainly not going to create a new security environment. The Americans and Chinese are working off their own agendas. They're going to ensure that. What you want to do is make sure this doesn't break. Because my concern is that over the course of right now, we're talking about One Belt, One Road. We're talking about a Chinese Marshall Plan. But over the next 10 years, even if China's successful, the lift that is required to transform their economy will be so enormous that they will be overwhelmingly domestically focused, which means that China's willingness to really provide a leadership role in the future of Asia is going to be very limited. It's going to be very linked to we got to do what we need to support our economy, right? That's what we're going to do. And we'll play a little bit around to improve our military situation, our security environment. But this is not transformative. Well, the Indians, they're doing more geopolitics, but these are baby steps. And Modi doesn't have anywhere near the diplomatic corps he'd need to make that happen anyway. They still are tiny, tiny compared to, I don't know if you got, one of my favorite statistics, India has 1.2 billion people. New Zealand has 4 million. Their diplomatic corps have the same number of people, right? But we don't expect anything from New Zealand, right? But like India, we're like, we got to do trade, we got to do climate. No, they literally don't have the capability, right? So these economies are not going to get this done. And so I think that what's wonderful about Asia right now is the fact that they are actually at least being strategic about their own countries. That's positive. And I think that's the best we can hope, is that they continue to prioritize that, and that can become an agenda that you can create some cooperation. Look, another reason why Paris worked from a very low bar is because individual countries were doing enough on climate themselves that they could all get together and say, look, here's what we're all doing. And they could pretend that was an agreement, which is what America and China did on climate. The Americans said, here's what we're doing. The Chinese said, here's what we're doing. They said, great, let's get people to paper that and we'll sign it. You didn't actually move the needle together, but you just kind of took something that existed, you put a tablecloth on it, you set the table, and you said, here, guys, look, we're eating. How about you guys? Right? That's okay. You know, when the alternative is the Middle East, I'm good with that. Right? That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, now let's open to the audience, and I have some time for the questions. Takeda-san. Would you please say your name and your affiliation first?
Sure. Dr. Bremmer, thank you very much for your great insight. My name is Katsuo Takeda of Morgan Stanley. Nothing is sure in this world, as you know, as we know. And then last 50 years, Soviet Union disappeared, transformed to Russia, and the whole map in Europe changed. And then China transformed to a second largest country in the last 50 years. So what do you expect in the last 50 years? What kind of world will appear we can expect in the 50 years?
I can't do 50. No, it's not a fair question, because you asked the last 50, implying that the next 50 would be kind of like equivalent in terms of transformation, when in reality the next 10 will be, you know, as transformative as the last 50. So it's only fair to ask me about the next decade. And I'll give you that answer. The thing that I was most disappointed about in the Obama piece is he was asked what was the main threat to the United States over the long term, and he said climate, which is wrong.
Climate change.
Which is wrong. I mean, climate is existential over the long term, but technology is existential like in the next 10 years. I mean, we've got a study that came from Oxford University that says that 47% of all American jobs will be under high risk of being automated in the next 10 years. I mean, this is well before the United States sees the effects of 4 degrees of centigrade warming, well before we start having to build walls to ensure that waters do not swamp the Japan Society, well before that happens, we are going to be taken over by our robot overlords, right? So we need to understand the implications of artificial intelligence. We need to understand the transformative nature of automation. We need to understand how all of these technologies are completely transforming every sector in society, from driverless automobiles to big pharma, to the defense sector, to service sector, to financial services. Everywhere I go, I see people that are saying labor no longer matters as much to our sector. Well, where are the new jobs coming from? There are some great new jobs coming, but where are the numbers? I don't know. So what are you going to do as a consequence? We're going to make a lot of money. Well, you're going to make a lot of money, but who are you selling it to? And how's that going to work? And what about emerging markets who are like poor, and they've got people that are expecting an awful lot, and you're not going to be able to give it to them? They're going to be really upset. And they're going to have smartphones that will allow them to organize. And then what are you going to do? Huh? What are you going to do? So, I mean, come on. Climate? Like, climate was the big threat 10, 20 years ago, and now it's been subsumed by something that's come a lot faster. And the thing that frustrates me is that Obama is a contemporary of mine. He's the first president we've ever had who kind of grew up in the same intellectual environment. And so I kind of feel like intellectually simpatico with him in a way that I couldn't understand Bill Clinton or Bush Sr. or Bush Jr. or any of those guys, right? And yet, like, on this one thing that he should get, he's just off the reservation. I'm like, damn, like, you got to get this. Because if he doesn't, no one's going to. I mean, Hillary versus Trump or Cruz, good luck on that, right? I mean, you know, Hillary had her own email account. I mean, she's not doing technology right? She uses a BlackBerry, for Christ's sake. Yeah. We're done. Yeah. That's over, you know?
Yeah. That's why it's risk number 6 of this year, right?
And Bernie Sanders uses a typewriter. So, I mean, it's a serious problem.
But he's very good at using social media.
Yeah, I know.
Sanders, yes.
I know.
Yes.
Yeah, his grandson does the whole thing, I'm told. That's what it is. It's all very...
Okay, I think we have time just for one more questions.
That's not fair. Can we do a couple more questions?
Is it okay, Jennifer?
Do you guys want to do a couple more questions?
Sure. Okay.
How many people, show of hands, how many people want to do a couple more questions? Awesome. We're gonna let's do 3 questions. Okay,
right.
Sorry. I'll be fast, I promise.
Would you please say your name too? Please, go ahead. There's a microphone coming, yes.
Masazumi Nakayama, Citigroup. I want to know your historical view of U.S. foreign aid. How do you evaluate Marshall Plan?
I think that the Marshall Plan was probably one of the single most strategic, far-sighted, and successful policies that the Americans have ever implemented. I mean, you know, you coming out of World War II, you're the only country left standing, and you put over time effectively 10% of American GDP into supporting Europeans to make them not only effective markets, but also so that you can build a global economic system that you will over time benefit from. What is so frustrating is that the idea of doing even 1/10 of that in the United States today is such a non-starter for anyone with political aspirations. America, and that's one of the reasons why I came to the reluctant conclusion that indispensable America was not feasible. I mean, look, as someone who grew up during the Cold War and lived in the former Soviet Union for a period of time, something that most young people have not had any experience with, indispensable America appeals directly to my heart and to my soul. My parents and my grandparents, you know, came over, immigrant families. My grandmother was from Aleppo, believe it or not,
Wow.
and came through Ellis Island, half part Syrian, part Armenian. And so, I mean, if there's anyone that should want indispensable America in terms of their background, it's me. I grew up in the projects. I felt like I had every opportunity, right? So, I mean, that's what America stands for. But I just don't see it. I just don't think it's feasible. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves. I'm sick and tired of hearing political leaders that are telling us how we're going to be the great America taking care of all these problems. I mean, even Trump saying, I'm the only person, I alone, said this, he tweeted this yesterday, I alone can resolve the terrorist problem. I'm like, well, damn, we should send him over there. Because I know a few thousand Americans that really don't want to be fighting that fight, you know, so that would be awesome, you know? And then after he finishes that, then I would vote him president at that. He does that. I'm like, hey, no problem. That'd be great.
Over there, the person, yes.
You guys are great, by the way. This is a fantastic Japan Society audience. I want to tell you that. I don't know if we're actually videotaping this or stuff, but this is fun.
Thank you. My name is David Bunt. In February, the economist Jeffrey Sachs wrote a series of articles arguing that Hillary Clinton is actually a neocon and that her record as Secretary of State was one of the most militaristic in recent history. I wanted to know what you thought of that and if you think she would benefit from reading the J-Curve.
Well, I think everyone would benefit from reading the J-Curve. It was an outstanding book, an author you should all know. I wrote it in 2006. No, I appreciate you asking that question. I think Jeffrey Sachs has an ideological perspective, right? I mean, he is, one of the most, sort of fervent, serious left-wing economists out there. I like him personally. I think he's very smart. I am not particularly ideological, and so I get somewhat unnerved by those kind of statements. You cannot look objectively at Hillary's record and say that she was an overwhelming hawk. While she did support going into Libya, she only did it after the Gulf allies were clamoring for it. The Arab League, who we hadn't heard from for decades, were clamoring for it. The French were saying, allons-y, the Brits, right? And then it was with conditions. The Americans did not lose one fighter pilot in Libya, and it was only with Benghazi, Now, I happen to believe that Libya turned into a disaster, and I think that Hillary should not be blamed for Benghazi, but she should be blamed for Libya becoming a failed state. But the French should be blamed more, and the Brits should be blamed more, and the Saudis should be blamed more. Blame us for Iraq, no problem. Blame us for Afghanistan, I'll take that. Blame the Soviets too. But come on, America doesn't get blamed for everything, right? And Libya was largely outside groups. I absolutely think that Hillary airs, hawkish, but Hillary, and on China too, although with China, frankly, on geoeconomics, I think Hillary was ahead of that issue in a way that a lot of other people weren't. On Syria, I tend to think that Hillary's initial, I think we should do a lot more, was mistaken. But I also think Hillary backed down immediately when she saw there wasn't support for it. So I would consider her much more pragmatic on these issues than hawkish. My big problem with Hillary is that I really don't feel like another 8 years of scandal, like we had with with Cheney and Rumsfeld and the Bush White House, and like we did in Clinton land before, and we're going to get it. We didn't get it with Hillary as Secretary of State because that was just Hillary. But once we get the entire Clinton Inc. apparatus around her with a lot of money that's been paid for a lot of access, it's coming back. And that really annoys me because it's been so nice to not have those scandals over the course of the last years. And especially, I'm not sure, Bill Clinton, as incredibly astute a politician he was, as incredibly bright as he was, I think with today's level of transparency and intrusiveness of the media, I'm not sure he would have lasted as president. And I worry that a Clinton presidency in 2017 is going to be completely crippled by that kind of, constantly just fighting, sort of all of this incredibly intrusive media. And Obama, for all of Obama's unwillingness to work with Congress and ideological polemicism, the fact is that in an incredibly transparent environment where the media leaves no stone unturned, we haven't had any scandals. Tiny stuff for 6 years. I think that's extraordinary. So again, you can Benghazi scandal. There've been a couple, but comparatively speaking, you would expect it to just be getting exponentially greater under every administration. So that absolutely worries me. But of course, if you had Trump, think about what a Trump kitchen cabinet with his family and business connections would look like. And you realize that would probably be a little bit worse, right? So, at the end of the day.
You said it's really bad for Japan if Trump is going to be the president.
I can't imagine a president that would be worse for Japanese interests than Trump.
Why do you say that?
Well, because Trump seems to be stuck in the 70s, right? And I'm not just talking about his hair. I mean specifically, the fact that he actually thinks that Japan is like a trade threat, and he doesn't understand how much diplomatic lifting the Japanese do. When the Americans tell the Germans and the French and the Brits what they want, those guys frequently just don't listen. They go the other way. When the Americans tell the Japanese, hey, we really need your help on this Iran thing. We really need your help on this Russia thing. The Japanese, immediately, they're like, we got to help these guys because they're doing so much for us. And Trump's complete obliviousness to that is, it's not unexpected because he doesn't do foreign policy. He's a business guy, and he only has been and for the last 10, 20 years, he's mostly been doing licensing. When he was really doing deals, then the Japanese were really, kind of eating the Americans' lunch. But you'd think that he'd have someone that would kind of get him up to speed on the last 20 years. Right? And I will tell you, it's funny, one of the first 5, he announced his 5 first foreign policy advisors last week, and one of them used to work for me.
Oh.
I know, we let him go very quickly. It was in the early days, and I'm like, damn, this is bad. I don't know what to do. It was kind of funny. So.
But what would you do if Trump asked you to be the advisor?
I would say no.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, my name is Victor Jermak. I'm with Heritage Capital.
Wait for the microphone, please, sir. Is this the last question?
Yes.
Last question.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Victor Jermak. I'm with Heritage Capital. We have something in common. My father was born in Aleppo in 1898, just like your grandmother. And I wonder, what constructive policy should the U.S. do with respect to Syria and the Middle East? What would you recommend if you were heading up foreign policy?
So first of all, I would take 3 different tacks. The first is that I would recognize that Syria is a problem for the United States, but it's a much bigger problem for the Europeans than the Americans. It's a much bigger problem for the Turks than the Europeans. It's a much bigger problem for the Lebanese and the Jordanians than it is for the Turks. And it's a much bigger problem for the Saudis, the Iraqis, the Syrians than it is for the Jordanians and the Lebanese. It's got kind of inverted Maslow's triangle going on there. And I think that we need to be very honest about that and be very honest about what we would be prepared to do if the countries for whom this is a much more serious problem are prepared to do a lot more. I think you have to be very credible that that support is not coming unless they do, because they won't do it otherwise. I do actually believe that. So there, I'm actually with a lot of the unilateralists. Secondarily, I think that the military solution is a very small piece of the solution. I do happen to believe that ISIS is Islamic. I can't stand people, academics out there that say that there is not Islamic. They're fundamentally Islamic, and it's just that that there's been no reform. They're like Christians during the Crusades. And then there was Reformation in Christianity. The ISIS is completely unreformed Islam. And unreformed religion is quite dangerous in almost every manifestation. But we shouldn't pretend. Now, I am sympathetic to Obama not wanting to call it Islamic, radical Islam, even though he knows it is, because he recognizes that the more he says it, the more he actually gets sucked into the conflict. He's trying to avoid that, and he's already bad at avoiding it. So if you're not going to be strong enough to avoid it, you might as well find ways to, push it off. That's why I was also glad he didn't leave the Cuba-Argentina trip when Brussels hit. You can't, right. As president, you can't be chasing headlines. That's a huge mistake. So I'm glad he avoided that. But I think that the Americans need to spend less time focusing on the military. I saw our Secretary of Defense said we need more Saudi support in bombing these guys. No, we don't. We don't need Saudi support in bombing them. We need Saudi support in creating a model for tens of millions of young Muslims who have nothing to do and no jobs. They need to.
You think that's the core root?
Absolutely.
Right.
We need to stop the demand for ISIS. There's a demand for drugs. We want drugs. We've got money for them. We buy them. If you don't stop that demand, drugs will come to us. So terrorism, there's a demand for terror. These young, mostly men, and some women too, have nothing to do. And the money has gone away. And the countries can't write checks. If you don't reform, and I think it's too late, sadly, but if you don't reform, they're in serious trouble. The third thing I would do, the Americans are leading the world, including Japan. Japan's number 2. The Americans are leading the world in humanitarian aid to Syria. Thank God. And give us credit for that. And that's the government, and it's the private sector, and it's churches, and it's people. Thank God that we truly have in our hearts, we may be saying we're angry, we're disappointed, but we do fundamentally care as human beings. And that's why we continue to have the most philanthropic country and people in the world, and we should never forget it. We need to do much more of that. But our country needs to accept these people. I really believe it. And yes, some of these people are terrorists, and some of them are going to fake it. But we have a 2-year process of vetting. We're vastly better at integrating Muslims when they come to the U.S. than the Europeans are. We're not like France, where we put them all in slums. You look at Michigan, and you see how incredible they've been at rebuilding Detroit. You look at the Libyan community in Cincinnati, and you see how wealthy they are. These are people that can find a home. And by the way, Americans are really good at integrating in. That's why our police are not only do we catch a lot of these early, we even entrap a lot of them. We're like, oh, you seem a little weird. You want to buy a bomb? He wasn't even really thinking about buying a bomb. He's like, yeah, as a matter of fact, you're done now, right? Like that. We're better at this stuff. I mean, some civil liberties get walked on, but at the end of the day, precautionary principle. So when I think about what we need to do, yeah, I'm okay. I liked what Justin Trudeau did. He's like way too politically correct from my perspective, but nonetheless, he said, we're not going to take in any unattached Syrian men. They got to be families, or they got to be women, they got to be kids. You know what? Great. Let's just take only women, but let's take 150,000. Let's bring them in, let's integrate them. Why not? And their kids. Better than nothing. I think we've taken in 1,500. It makes me physically nauseous. That's all we've done. Of all the things we've talked about, it really does. And look, I know I'm a political scientist. I'm meant to be objective. I do my damnedest. I really do. But I'm also a human being. And I can't sit and watch us do the world's most powerful, wealthiest country that existed as a melting pot, watch us stand by while the Germans are overrun, while the Canadians are doing vastly more, and while we sit and do nothing. That is unacceptable to me. And I think that has to be a part of the solution. I really do believe that. And if I affect one person by saying that in every audience I speak to, I'm going to keep saying it. So if we can end on that, that's not a bad note to end on. But thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.